Hey guys, tonight we are going to sit with a family you think you already know. You grew up with them. Maybe not you exactly, but your mother did, or your grandmother did, on a sofa in front of a television, or with a worn library book open on her knees. The cabin, the covered wagon, the fiddle in the dark, the little girls in their bonnets. You were told that this was the family that survived, the family that made it, the one that turned hunger and blizzards and empty prairie into something warm enough to read to a child at bedtime. And here is the thing you were quietly allowed to believe. That somewhere out there, right now, in a town in South Dakota or Missouri or California, there is a person who carries that blood. A great-great-grandchild with the same chin as the man who played the fiddle. Someone who could stand at a grave and say, "That was my family." There isn't. There is no one. Not a single living soul on this earth descends from Charles and Caroline Ingalls. The line is gone. It did not fade slowly into a big, scattered family tree the way most pioneer families did. It stopped, cold, and the woman who watched it stop, one cradle at a time, was the mother, Caroline, the one the books call Ma. She had 5 children. She buried the future of all 5 of them before she died, and she did it mostly in silence. Because that was the only thing the frontier ever really taught her to do well. So tonight we are not going to talk about the legend. We are going to count 5 children. Then we are going to follow the blood forward, year by year, grave by grave, and watch it run out. And by the end, you are going to understand something the book spent 100 years making sure you never felt: the cost. Before we go in, do me one favour. If you find these stories worth your time, tap subscribe. It is free, it keeps these long nights of history coming, and it genuinely keeps this channel alive. And while you settle in tonight, get comfortable, turn the lights down, let the day go, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from, your town, your time. I read them. It is a strange and good feeling to know exactly who is awake out there in the dark with me while we go back 150 years. All right, blanket up, lights low. Let's begin where every family begins, with a mother and a number. 5. That was the number Caroline Ingalls carried. Most people, when they think of the Ingalls family, picture the 4 girls. Mary, the oldest, gold-haired and good. Laura, the wild one, the one who would grow up and tell everyone. Carrie, the small one. Grace, the baby. 4 daughters lined up like steps on a staircase, and that is the picture the books framed and hung on the wall of the American memory. But Caroline did not have 4 children. She had 5, and the 5th one is where this whole story starts to go quiet, because the 5th one was a boy, and the boy is the first thing the legend learned to leave out. Hold that. We will come back to him, and when we do, it is going to hurt more than you expect. First, understand the world she was counting in. Caroline Lake Quiner married Charles Ingalls on the 1st of February 1860 in Wisconsin. She was 20. He was 23. By the standards of the frontier, that was not young. That was right on time, maybe even a little late. A woman married, and then a woman had children, and the having of children was not a sweet domestic hobby. It was labour in the oldest and most dangerous sense of the word. It was the job. The family was the farm, and the children were the future of the farm, and on the prairie, the future had a brutal habit of dying before it grew up. You have to sit with the numbers of that era to feel what she was up against. In the 1870s, in the rural American Midwest, roughly 1 in 5 children did not live to see their 5th birthday. 1 in 5, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, diarrheal disease that could empty a baby out in 3 days flat. There were no antibiotics. There was no rehydration drip. There was a mother, a damp cloth, a doctor who might be 40 miles away across mud, and prayer. That was the entire medical system standing between Caroline Ingalls and the loss of everything she made. So when Caroline had a child, she was not just having a child. She was placing a bet against some of the worst odds a human being has ever quietly accepted as normal. She placed that bet 5 times. Mary Amelia came first in 1865 in the woods of Wisconsin, then Laura Elizabeth in 1867, then Caroline Celestia, Carrie, in 1870 out in Kansas on the land that gave the most famous book its name. Then, in 1875, the boy. And finally Grace Pearl, in 1877, in a hotel, Iowa, in a chapter of the family's life they would later try very hard to forget. 5 children, across 4 different states, carried in a wagon between all of them. And that constant motion is going to matter more than you would think, because it did not just scatter the living, it scattered the dead. Most families, even poor ones, end up gathered in a grave or two, a churchyard, a family plot, everyone in roughly one place, so that a descendant can stand in a single spot and be among all of them. Not this family. By the time the story's over tonight, the bodies of Charles and Caroline Ingalls' blood will be spread across the entire map of the country they kept crossing. A lost grave in Minnesota, a row of stones in Smet, South Dakota, a baby in Salt Lake City, Utah, a grave in Mansfield, Missouri, a death in Connecticut. They moved so much in life that even in death, they could not be brought together. There is no single place you can stand and be among the Ingalls family. They are smeared across a continent, the way they lived, in pieces that were never gathered up. Hold that picture. A family scattered from Minnesota to Connecticut, because the scattering and the vanishing are the same story told 2 different ways. A family that never stayed anywhere, and then, in the end, did not stay at all. And here is the first thing that should stop you. Caroline Ingalls, the mother of the most beloved family in American storytelling, the woman whose daughters and granddaughter would sell tens of millions of books. Caroline Ingalls has no descendants. None. Not through Mary. Not through Laura. Not through Carrie. Not through the boy. Not through Grace. 5 children, and the blood ends with all 5. Now, your instinct right now is to argue with me. That can't be right. A family that big, that famous, in an era when people had 6, 8, 10 kids. Somebody's line had to survive. Somebody must have a great grandchild teaching school in Minnesota right now. That is exactly the instinct the legend is counting on. Because the truth is so unlikely, so statistically strange, that your brain refuses it. A pioneer family with 5 children producing 0 surviving descendants is not normal. It is almost an anomaly. It took a very specific, very cruel sequence of events. A dead baby, a blindness, 2 empty marriages, a stillbirth, and a single surgery in a Kansas City hospital to erase the bloodline this completely. We are going to walk through every link in that chain, and the woman standing at the centre of it, watching each link break, is Ma. But to understand what she lost, you have to throw out the Ma you think you know. The television gave you a soft woman, a warm, round, gentle mother in an apron, smiling by the stove, the emotional cushion of the household. That is a costume. The real Caroline Quiner Ingalls was harder than that, and she had every reason to be. She had grown up poor in a way her daughters would never fully grasp. Her own father drowned in Lake Michigan when she was 5 years old, leaving her mother a widow with 6 children and almost nothing. Caroline learned, before she was old enough to spell the word, exactly what happens to a family when the man who holds it up suddenly is not there anymore. She watched her own mother count children and count pennies and come up short. So, Caroline grew into a woman who controlled what she could. She insisted on manners, on schooling, on clean collars in the middle of nowhere. People mistake that for primness. It was not primness. It was a woman who had seen the bottom drop out once, as a child, and spent the rest of her life with her hands braced against the floor, making sure it never dropped out again. You can see it in the small things the record kept. She wanted her girls to have books in a place where books were a luxury. She wanted them in school whenever a school existed, which on the frontier was not often and not for long. She had been a school teacher herself before she married, an educated woman by the standards of her world, and she carried that education into the wilderness like a candle she was determined not to let blow out. When other families let their children run half wild, because there was simply no time for anything but survival, Caroline drilled letters and manners and Sundays into hers. That was not vanity. That was a woman who understood, from the inside, that education and respectability were the only ladders a poor family had, and she was not going to let her daughters grow up without the rungs, and every move tested her. Think about what moving actually meant for the person who ran the household. She was the one who packed the wagon, decided what came and what got left behind, what a family's entire life weighed when it had to fit between 2 wooden wheels. She was the one who made cold camps warm, who stretched flour that was running low, who kept 4 small children calm while the land rolled by for weeks. Charles felt the pull of the horizon. Caroline felt the weight of the load. He dreamed in open country. She did the accounting in the dark. And she did it over and over and over. Wisconsin to Kansas, to Wisconsin to Minnesota to Iowa, and back, then finally out to Dakota. Each time folding up a home she had just managed to make livable because the man she loved had heard about somewhere better. She almost never said no. That is the part that should land. A woman this controlled, this watchful, followed a restless husband across half a continent and mostly kept her objections behind her teeth. The frontier did not give wives a vote on much, so she swallowed the risk and managed the fallout. And she got very, very good at carrying things in silence. Remember that. It is going to matter all the way at the end, when the thing she has to carry in silence is the death of her family's entire future. And it is that woman, controlled, watchful, bracing, who is going to spend the next 50 years watching the one thing she could not control. Whether her children's children would live, she married a dreamer. That is the part the books got right and then made charming. Charles Ingalls was restless. He heard about better land the way other men heard music, and every time he heard it, the wagon came out and the family moved. Wisconsin, Kansas, back to Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Minnesota again, Dakota Territory. Caroline followed a man whose hope kept turning into another packed wagon, and she did the math on every move that he never had to do, what it would cost, who might not survive it. Because moving on the frontier was not just exhausting, it was deadly. New water made children sick. New towns brought new diseases their bodies had never met. Every mile the wagon rolled was a mile of fresh risk to the smallest people in it. And in 1876, on one of those moves, the risk came due. The family was leaving Minnesota, heading east toward Iowa, and they stopped along the way at the farm of Charles's brother, Peter, near a little place called South Troy. They had the 4 older children, and they had the baby, the boy, 9 months old, just learning to be a person, just becoming somebody. By the time they left that farm, they were carrying one less. Who was he? Why does almost nobody know his name? And why did Laura, who wrote down everything, who turned her whole childhood into 8 famous books? Why did Laura leave her only brother out of every single one of them? That is where we go next. To the first grave, the smallest one. The one nobody can even find anymore. 60,000. That is a rough number for how many American children, in a single bad year of the 1870s, died before the age of 1, in a country far smaller than today, year after year after year. We say the words high infant mortality now, and they slide right past us, clean and statistical. The people living inside that number did not get to keep it clean. For them it was a wet cloth at 3 in the morning, and a small chest that would not stop heaving. You cannot understand what happened to Caroline Ingalls' family unless you understand the killing field she was raising children on. So let me make it real for a moment, because the legend scrubbed all of this out, and the scrubbing is the whole reason the ending feels so impossible to you. Start with the diseases, because there was a whole army of them, and they hunted the young. Diphtheria came for the throat. It grew a grey membrane across a child's airway until the child suffocated in its own bed, and the family could only watch. Scarlet fever burned through households, jumping child to child, leaving some dead and some, like Mary, marked for life. Whooping cough racked a baby until it could not breathe between the coughs. Typhoid rode in on bad water. Measles, which we think of as nothing, killed regularly. And in the warm months came the quiet murderer the old records called the summer complaint, infant diarrhea, usually from milk or water carrying bacteria no one could see, which dried a baby out from the inside in a matter of days. That is the one, you will remember, that the clerk wrote next to Freddie's name. Now stack the conditions on top of the diseases. No antibiotics. Penicillin was more than half a century away. No vaccines for most of this. No understanding in the early years of germs at all. Many people still believed sickness came from bad air. Water was drawn from wells and creeks that sat downhill from privies and barnyards. Milk was raw and warm and unrefrigerated. Doctors, where they existed, were often hours away over bad roads, and half of what they carried in the bag did more harm than good. A mother on a claim in Dakota was, for practical purposes, the entire hospital, her hands, her judgment, her prayers, and whatever she could or boil. And here is the psychological fact that we today can barely hold in our heads. These mothers expected to bury children, not as a tragedy that might happen, as a near certainty that probably would. A woman who bore 6 or 8 children fully anticipated that 1 or 2 or 3 of them would not grow up. It was so common that the culture built rituals around it. The mourning photographs of dead infants, the tiny coffins a town carpenter could make from memory, the specific small size of grave in every frontier cemetery. Grief was not rare. Grief was a season, and it came around again and again. But, and this is the turn, understanding that it was common does not mean it stopped hurting. That is the lie people tell themselves about the past. They imagine that because death was everywhere, people felt it less. They did not. A mother in 1876 loved her 9-month-old exactly as much as a mother in this room loves hers tonight. The frequency of the wound did not numb the wound. It just meant she had to keep functioning around it because there were 4 other children who needed supper, and the wagon was leaving at dawn, whether she had finished grieving or not. That is the world Caroline Ingalls bet 5 children into. And now watch how the family's own choices raised the odds against them. They moved, constantly. We touched on this, but here is why it mattered for the children specifically. Every move took the family to new water their bodies had never adjusted to, new towns carrying new strains of disease, new isolation far from whatever doctor they had come to trust. A settled family at least knew its own well and its own neighbours. The Ingalls family kept pulling up stakes and rolling into the unknown. And the smallest passengers in the wagon paid the steepest price for it. Charles chased land. Caroline did the quiet arithmetic of risk that her husband's hope never forced him to do. And in 1876, mid-move, the arithmetic came due on the youngest and most fragile life in the wagon. So when I tell you tonight that this family lost a baby, and then a grandbaby, and then a great-grandbaby, when I tell you about 3 small graves in 3 states, I do not want you to hear it as some Gothic curse hanging over the Ingalls name. There was no curse. There was a country that killed its children casually and at scale, and a family that, through movement and bad luck and the ordinary cruelty of the era, happened to land on the wrong side of those odds again and again until there was nothing left. The horror is not that it was supernatural. The horror is that it was completely normal. It was simply the frontier, doing to one famous family what it did to thousands of forgotten ones. We just happen to have the forgotten ones' names tonight. Or, in the case of the smallest of them, we don't even have that. Let me show you what I mean. Let me take you to the first grave. The one in the county record, the one with the ugly clinical word, the one nobody on earth can find anymore. There is a county record in Wabasha, Minnesota, that almost nobody reads. It is a death register. Plain ink, plain lines, the kind of book a clerk filled out at the end of a long day, without feeling anything. Because feeling everything would have killed him, and on one of those lines, dated the 27th of August, 1876, there is a name written small. Fred Ingalls. Cause of death, the clerk wrote, was diarrhea. That is it. That is the entire official monument to Caroline Ingalls' only son. One line, one ugly clinical word. A baby reduced to a symptom in a book of the dead. His real name was Charles Frederick Ingalls. They named him after his father. Think about what that means on the frontier. You do not give a baby the father's name lightly. That name is an inheritance. It is the family saying, this is the one who carries us forward. This is the boy who keeps the Ingalls name alive when the girls marry off and become Wilders and Swanseas and Dows. He was born on the 1st of November 1875 in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. The same Walnut Grove, Plum Creek, the dugout, the grasshopper years. He was born into the most famous setting in the entire saga, and the saga erased him anyway. The family called him Freddie. He lived 9 months and 26 days. Think about what a baby is at that age. 9 months is the age where a child stops being a bundle and starts being a person. He would have been sitting up, reaching for things and maybe pulling himself toward the edge of furniture, getting ready to stand. He would have known his mother's face and his father's voice, and the particular way the light came through the window of whatever room they were in that month. He would have had a laugh by then, a real one, the kind that stops a tired family cold and makes the whole hard day worth it for a second. That is the age he died at, not a faceless newborn. A little person who had just become somebody, who his 3 older sisters had started to play with, who Caroline had carried through a Minnesota winter and a Minnesota spring, believing, the way you have to believe, that this one was going to make it. And then the summer came, and the move came, and the sickness came, and in a matter of days he was gone. What happened to the family afterward tells you how little room the frontier gave for grief. They did not stop. They could not. They went on to Iowa, to a town called Burr Oak, where Charles took over the running of a hotel, a step down, really, from the independent farming life he had dreamed of, a sign of how hard things had gotten. And it was there, in that hotel, less than a year after burying Freddie, that Caroline gave birth to her last child, Grace, in 1877. Picture the compression of that. A woman buries her infant son one summer and is pregnant again, then delivering again the next. There was no period of mourning the modern mind would recognize. There was a dead baby in Minnesota and a new baby in an Iowa hotel room, separated by months, and a mother who had to love the new one with the same hands that had just let go of the last one. That was not coldness. That was the only way through. Now here is where I have to be careful, because this is exactly the kind of moment where storytellers reach for drama they cannot back up. We do not know with certainty the full medical picture of what took Freddie. The record says diarrhea, and on the surface that sounds almost trivial to a modern ear. It was not trivial. In 1876, a sustained diarrheal illness in an infant meant dehydration, and dehydration in a baby that age, with no clinic, no clean intravenous fluids, no way to put back what the body was losing, that was very often a death sentence. A strong baby could be gone in days. What the record points toward is not a freak event. It is the single most common way frontier babies died. The family had just left Walnut Grove. They were on the move again. Charles had heard about work in Iowa, and they broke the journey at the farm of Charles's brother Peter, near South Troy. So Freddie did not die at home in a place that was theirs. He died in transit, in between, on somebody else's land mid-move, the way so much of this family's grief would happen, in the gap between one hope and the next. And what did Laura say about it? Laura, who remembered everything. Laura, who would fill 8 books with the smell of hay and the sound of Pa's fiddle and the exact colour of a hair ribbon she wore at age 6. In her entire published Little House series, every page, every chapter, every winter, Laura Ingalls Wilder never once mentions that she had a brother. He is simply not there. The books move from the Plum Creek years to the Silver Lake years, and a careful reader would never know a baby boy had lived and died and been buried in between. Her biographers have a theory about why, and it is not a flattering one for the legend, but it is a deeply human one. They believe the memory was too painful. That a grown woman, sitting at a desk in Missouri in the 1930s, building a warm and golden version of her childhood for children to read, simply could not put the dead baby into it. The warmth had no room for him, so she left him on the cutting floor. But here is the part that tells you it was not forgetting, it was choosing. Years before the famous books, Laura wrote a raw, unpublished memoir for adults. It was called Pioneer Girl. It was the true version, the one with the ugly parts left in. And in Pioneer Girl, she does write about her brother. She does not write much, but what she writes is one of the most devastating sentences in the whole archive of this family. She remembered that little brother was not well, and then she remembered the end of it like this. One terrible day, she wrote, he straightened out his little body and was dead. Read that again, slowly, the way she must have written it. He straightened out his little body. That is not a literary flourish. That is a person describing something she actually watched. A spasm, a small body going rigid, and then nothing. That is an eyewitness, 60 years later, still able to see it. So Laura did not forget Freddie. She remembered him precisely enough to describe his death in a single unbearable image. She just made sure that the children of America would never have to see it. She protected the legend from her own brother's body. That is the first thing the myth cost. Not a lie, exactly, an edit. A small grave, quietly left out of the picture so the picture could stay warm And where is that grave now? This is the detail I cannot get out of my head. Freddie was buried on Peter Ingalls' farm near South Troy, family land. The idea, surely, was that he would rest among his own. But the frontier did not keep its promises about permanence. Peter's farm changed hands. The years rolled over it. The markers, if there ever were proper markers for a 9-month-old in 1876, did not survive. And today, the exact location of Charles Frederick Ingalls' grave is unknown, lost. There is no headstone you can drive to, no fenced little plot with his name. The first child the bloodline lost is also the first one the earth swallowed completely. So, picture Caroline now, 1876. She has just buried her only son in a hole on her brother-in-law's land, and within days the wagon is moving again, because it has to, because there is work in Iowa and 4 living children to feed. She does not get to stay by the grave. She does not get a year of mourning in a quiet house. She climbs back onto the wagon seat, and she rides away from her son's body, and she keeps the other 4 calm while she does it, and she almost certainly does not let them see her break, because that is what she learned at 5, when her own father drowned. You do not get to stop. You count what is left, and you keep it alive. 4 left, 4 daughters, and surely, out of 4 healthy girls the line is safe. 4 daughters in an era of big families. That is 4 chances at grandchildren, 4 chances at a future, 4 staircases of little ones to fill the empty place the boy left. That is what any reasonable person in 1876 would have assumed. Every one of those 4 chances was going to fail, and the first one was going to fail in the cruelest way possible, not with a death, but with a darkness that fell over the oldest, most promising daughter while she was still very much alive. Her name was Mary, and in a few short years she was going to open her eyes one morning and not be able to see her own mother's face. What is a daughter worth in 1880 on the American frontier? That is a brutal question, and I want you to sit in how brutal it is, because Caroline Ingalls had to think in those terms whether she wanted to or not. A daughter was loved, yes, but a daughter was also a future. She would grow, and she would marry, and she would bring a husband into the family's orbit, and she would have children, and those children would carry the family forward into a world the parents would never see. A daughter was the bridge between the family that was and the family that would be. And of all 4 Ingalls daughters, the one who looked most certain to build that bridge was the oldest, Mary. Mary Amelia Ingalls was, by every account, the golden one, beautiful in the way the era prized, fair, calm, obedient, devout. She had the long blonde hair the books never stopped describing. She was the good daughter, the careful one, the one who did her lessons and minded her mother, and seemed built, from the cradle, for exactly the respectable future a frontier family dreamed of. If you had stood in that house in 1878 and asked which girl would marry well, raise a yard full of children, every neighbour in Walnut Grove would have pointed at Mary. Then, in the winter of 1879 and into 1880, when Mary was 14 years old, she got sick. It came on as a fever, a bad one, the kind that empties a house of sleep. For days the family did not know if she would live at all, and there was a stretch where the illness seemed to attack one side of her face, pulling it, and the local doctor used a word the family would repeat for the rest of their lives. He said it was a kind of stroke, brought on by the fever, and as the fever finally broke and Mary began, slowly, to come back to herself, the family realised that something had not come back with her, her sight. It did not happen all at once, the way the television liked to show it. It faded. Over days, maybe a couple of weeks, the light went out of Mary Ingalls' eyes, gradually, until there was nothing left but blur, and then not even that. By the time she was fully recovered from the fever, she was completely, permanently blind. 14 years old, the golden daughter sitting in a dim room, learning that the dark was not going to lift now. The books told you it was scarlet fever. For 100 years, that is the story every reader carried. Mary went blind from scarlet fever, and here is where I have to do the honest thing, instead of the easy thing, because the easy thing is to just repeat it. Modern researchers have gone back through the symptoms Laura actually described, the facial paralysis, the specific progression, the way it moved, and a number of them have argued scarlet fever does not fit. The leading modern theory, published in a medical journal, is that Mary most likely suffered from viral meningoencephalitis, an inflammation of the brain and its lining. It fits the symptoms far better than scarlet fever ever did. Why does that matter to our story? Because it tells you something about how this family handled hard truth. The real diagnosis was complicated, frightening, hard to explain to a child. Scarlet fever was a clean, familiar word. Everyone knew scarlet fever, so somewhere along the line, the messy truth got smoothed into the tidy version, and the tidy version is the one that went into the books, and the one America believed for a century. That is not lying. It is the same instinct that left Freddie out. Take the unbearable thing and make it a little more bearable, a little more explainable, for the people who have to live with it. But Mary still had to live in the real version, the dark one. And here is what blindness meant for the bloodline, because this is the part the gentle retellings never connect. In 1880, a blind woman did not marry. I am not saying it was impossible. I am saying that the entire social and economic machine of that world was built to make it almost impossible. Marriage was a practical arrangement as much as a romantic one. A wife was expected to run a household, manage a farm kitchen, raise children, do the relentless physical labour that kept a family alive. A blind woman was seen, cruelly, as a dependent, as someone who would need care rather than give it. The era had no place in its imagination for a blind wife and mother. So, the moment the light went out of Mary's eyes, a door closed that almost no one in the family would ever say out loud. The oldest daughter, the most promising one, the surest bet for grandchildren, her line was over before it began. Not because she died, because the world decided that a blind woman's future did not include children. The family did not abandon her to that darkness, and this is where you see who they really were. They did something extraordinary for people that poor. They scraped together the money, and Charles Ingalls even took a public position, in part, to help fund it, to send Mary to the Iowa College for the Blind, in Vinton. She learned to read by touch. She learned to make things with her hands, to do beadwork and weave, to play music, to keep herself useful in a world that had written her off as useless. She came home an educated woman in a household that had almost no education to spare. By the brutal standards of the time, the Ingalls family gave their blind daughter about the best life that a blind daughter could have. She spent about 7 years at that college in Vinton. Learn what she actually did there, because it reframes her completely. She read with her fingertips, raised dots under her hands, turning into Dickens and the Bible. She learned to play the organ. She did fine handwork, beadwork, hair wreaths, the intricate fancy work of the era, pieces good enough to be shown at fairs, made entirely by a woman who could not see a single stitch of what she was creating. Picture that. A blind woman's hands, moving with total precision over work her own eyes would never confirm, producing things careful enough to win a ribbon. Mary was not idle in her dark. She was relentlessly, quietly capable inside it. And that is exactly what makes her life so heavy to look at. The capability had nowhere to go. In another life, the one everyone had imagined for the golden eldest daughter, all of that intelligence and discipline and skill would have gone into a household, a husband, a yard full of children who carried her forward. Instead it went into wreaths and organ hymns in her parents' front room. She came home from Vinton in 1889, an accomplished woman with no world to be accomplished in. And she stayed. Through her father's death, through the century, through her mother's old age, Mary lived in that Smet house, her hands always busy with something, her future permanently shelved. When you hear that Mary Ingalls never married and had no children, do not picture a tragedy of weakness. Picture a capable woman that the world simply had no place for, sitting in a parlour, making beautiful things no one had asked her to make, growing older beside her mother, year after year after year. But there is a quieter fact underneath all of that effort, and it is the one that belongs to this story. Mary never left. After the college, she came home, and she stayed home. She lived with her mother and father, and then, when Pa died, she lived with Ma. For decades, the golden daughter became the permanent daughter, the one who never married, never moved out, never started a family of her own, because the world had made sure she couldn't, and Caroline took care of her. Year after year after year, long after the other girls had gone off to their own lives, Mary was there, in the house, blind and aging, and Ma was there beside her, doing the counting again. One daughter who would never give her a grandchild, not from death, from a fever and a closed door and a society that could not imagine anything else for her. And Mary's arc does not soften at the end, so I am not going to pretend it does. After Ma died in 1924, Mary lost the one person who had organised her entire adult life around caring for her. She did not have a husband to turn to, or children to take her in, because she had been denied both. So she moved between her sisters, staying with Carrie out in the Black Hills, with Grace on the farm, a blind, aging woman with no household of her own, passed gently between the homes of the two youngest, who had no children either. There is something almost unbearably tidy about that. The three surviving sisters at the end, none of them with a child, leaning on each other because there was no next generation to lean on. Mary died in 1928, 4 years after her mother, out at Carrie's. The golden daughter, the one everyone in Walnut Grove had pointed to as the future, died blind and childless at 63, having spent 48 years in the dark, and never once been given the life the whole family had imagined for her. One of the 5. Gone, and nothing after her. That is 2 of the 5 accounted for now. Freddie, in a lost grave in Minnesota. Mary in the dark in her mother's house for the rest of her life. But there were still 2 more daughters after Mary, the wild one and the babies, and one of them, the wild one, was about to do the thing the whole family was waiting for. She was going to fall in love. She was going to marry a strong young farmer with good horses. She was going to have a baby. And for one short window, it was going to look like the Ingalls bloodline had finally safely made it to the next generation. Then, in the space of 4 years, that young couple was going to lose almost everything, including a son so small that the newspaper printed his death before anyone had even given him a name. There is a small headstone in the cemetery at Smet, South Dakota. It is not large, it does not say much. It reads in effect, baby son. No first name, no given name at all, just the fact of him, and the year, 1889. That stone marks the grave of Laura Ingalls Wilder's only son, and the reason it has no name on it is that he died before the family put one on him. Let me take you back, because to understand that bare little stone you have to understand the 4 years that produced it. 4 years that started in pure hope and ended in ash. In August of 1885, Laura Ingalls married Almanzo Wilder. She was 18, he was 28, a serious young homesteader with the best horses in the county and a real claim of his own. This was the good match. This was the one the family had been waiting for. Laura was the wild one, the restless one, and now the wild one had landed safely, a husband with land, with horses, with a future. If any of the Ingalls daughters was going to carry the blood forward into a house full of grandchildren, it was going to be Laura and Almanzo Wilder. And at first, it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. In December of 1886, a little over a year into the marriage, Laura gave birth to a daughter. They named her Rose, and I need you to remember that name, and remember this baby, because Rose is the whole game now. Rose is the one grandchild, out of everything Caroline Ingalls hoped for, who is actually going to grow up. Everything. The entire survival of this bloodline is eventually going to come down to that one little girl born in a claim shanty in 1886. But nobody knew that yet. In 1886, Rose was not the last hope. She was just the first of what everyone assumed would be many. Then the 4 years happened. This is the stretch of Laura's life she later wrote about in a short, bleak little book called The First 4 Years, and it is the least cosy thing she ever wrote, because there was nothing cosy in it. Watch how fast it comes. The wheat crop failed, then it failed again. Drought baked the Dakota homestead. The debts stacked up, because Almanzo had borrowed against the future the way young farmers did, and the future was not paying. They were sliding year over year from hopeful young couple toward broke young couple. And then the bodies started to give out too. In 1888, both Laura and Almanzo caught diphtheria, both of them at the same time gravely ill. They survived it, but Almanzo did not survive it whole. either from the disease itself or from going back to heavy farm labour far too soon. While his body was still wrecked, Almanzo suffered some kind of stroke. He was not yet 32 years old, and for the rest of his life he would walk with a limp and never have the full strength of his legs and hands again. The strong young farmer with the best horses in the county became, in his early 30s, a partially disabled man. The engine of that household's future was permanently damaged. That is, the world Laura was living in. Sick husband, failing farm, mounting debt, a toddler named Rose underfoot when she got pregnant again. And in the summer of 1889 she had a boy, a son, the thing every frontier family wanted, a son to work the land, to carry the name, to be for Almanzo what Almanzo's father had been for him. After the dead crops and the diphtheria and the debt, here was a boy. Here, maybe, was the turn. He was born in July of 1889, and then, almost immediately, the record gets thin and terrible. The exact length of his life is one of those places where the sources do not fully agree. Some say he lived around 27 days, some accounts say closer to 12. And I am not going to pretend to a precision the documents do not give me. What we can say is this: he lived less than a month. Laura later described the end in words that match the way her baby brother Freddie had. Died 13 years earlier, words that should chill you with how familiar they had become to this family. She wrote that the baby was taken with spasms and died so quickly that the doctor was too late. Spasms, the same kind of end. A small body seizing, and no medicine on earth nearby to stop it. And here is the detail that I cannot make gentle, because it is not gentle. They never named him. The local newspaper in Smet ran a notice when the baby was born, and ran another notice when the baby died, and in neither one is there a first name. There was no name to print. He came and went so fast, in a household already buried under sickness and debt, that the naming never happened. He is, in the records, simply the infant son of A.J. Wilder, a boy who existed for a few weeks in the summer of 1889 and left without the one thing every human being is supposed to get for free: a name. Sit with that for one more second, because it is so easy to read past. A name is the cheapest gift there is. It costs nothing. It is the first thing every family gives a child, usually before the child has done anything at all, often before the child is even born. Parents argue happily for months about names, and this little boy, the grandson of Charles Ingalls, the nephew of the woman who would become one of the most read authors in the English language, did not get even that. The summer was too hard, the household too crushed, the weeks too few. He came, he struggled, he went, and the space on the stone where a name should go stayed blank. When the most basic gift a family can give gets skipped, you are looking at a family operating at the absolute edge of what people can endure. That is where Laura and Almanzo were in 1889, that far gone. Now hold both of these in your mind at once, because this is the pattern starting to show itself. Freddie, the boy named after his father, dead at 9 months, in a grave no one can find. And now Laura's boy, with no name at all, dead at a few weeks, under a stone that just says baby son. 2 sons, 2 summers 13 years apart, both gone almost before they began. The bloodline keeps trying to produce the boy who carries it forward, and the boy keeps dying. And then it gets worse, in a way that feels almost scripted by something cruel. Within weeks of the baby's death, weeks, the Wilders' house burned to the ground. A fire, possibly started in the kitchen, took the home Laura and Almanzo had built. So in a single brutal summer, Laura lost her newborn son, and then watched her house burn, while her husband was crippled, and the farm was failing, and the debts were still due. The first 4 years, that is how the marriage that was supposed to save the bloodline actually went. They survived it. Of course they survived it. Survival was the one skill this family had in abundance. They eventually left Dakota, drifted for a while, and finally landed in Mansfield, Missouri, at a place they called Rocky Ridge Farm, where they slowly, over decades, clawed their way back to something stable. Laura would live there until she was 90. She would become, in that farmhouse, the most beloved children's author in America. But she never had another child who lived. Rose, born 1886, was the only one. The boy of 1889 was the last baby Laura Ingalls Wilder ever bore. After that summer, there were no more. It took them years to climb out of that hole. They drifted, back to Almanzo's people for a while, down to Florida, which did not suit them, back to Smet broke. And finally, in 1894, Laura and Almanzo load a wagon one more time, the way her parents had loaded so many, and rolled south to Mansfield, Missouri, with $100 and a little girl named Rose, to a stony patch of Ozark hillside they would call Rocky Ridge. They built it up slowly, over decades, from a windowless cabin into a real farm, a real house, a real living. It was the stability Laura's whole childhood had never had, and it came at the price of being, finally, a family of 3, a husband, a wife, and 1 daughter. No more babies ever came to fill that farmhouse. That is the home where, much later, an old woman would sit down and start writing about her childhood, and accidentally become immortal. But the immortality was still 40 years away, and it would arrive in a house that had room for the grandchildren who never came. For now, just hold the simple hard fact. The strongest, most promising marriage in the whole family produced 1 surviving child, and 1 nameless grave, and then nothing. So now look at what Caroline has. Of her 4 daughters, the marriages were supposed to be the safety net. And the strongest marriage, the best bet, the Laura and Almanzo match, had produced exactly 1 surviving child, 1 granddaughter, Rose. And here is the quietest, saddest fact in this entire chapter. When Caroline Ingalls died, decades later, she was buried in the cemetery at Smet. And not far from her rests a small stone that says Baby Son, 1889. The grandmother and the grandson who never got a name, lying in the same ground. He was the closest Caroline ever came to a grandchild from Laura, other than Rose, and he lasted less than a month, and the family could not even give the stonecutter a name to carve. 2 daughters left to account for now, Carrie and Grace, the 2 little ones, the babies of the family. And you would think, after a lost boy, a blindness, and a nameless grave, that surely the law of averages owes this family something. Surely the 2 youngest girls, growing up in slightly better times, get to be the ones who finally fill the house with children. They both got married. That part is true. Neither of them ever had a child. And the story of why is so strange and so quietly sad that to this day the internet keeps getting it wrong, keeps insisting that one of them left descendants who are walking around today. They didn't. Let me show you the record. Here is a hard truth about being the youngest in a struggling family. By the time you are grown, the family has often used itself up on the ones who came before you. That is the shadow over Carrie and Grace Ingalls. They were the babies. Carrie, born in 1870, out on the Kansas Prairie, and Grace, born in 1877, in that hotel in Iowa, during the years the family barely talked about later. They grew up watching Mary go blind and become the daughter who needed everything, watching the family pour its thin resources into Mary's care and Mary's school, watching their parents age under the weight of it all. The 2 youngest girls grew up in a household whose emotional budget was already spent, and it marked them both, in different ways, and it is part of why neither of them ever built a family of her own. Start with Carrie. Caroline Celestia Ingalls, named for her mother, was small and frail her whole life. She had been a sickly baby, and she became a slight, delicate woman, never strong, often unwell. But she was sharp, she had a mind for words and for work, and she did something unusual for a woman of her time and place. She went into the newspaper business. She learned typesetting, the physical craft of setting metal type by hand, and she worked for papers across South Dakota, including out in the rough mining country of the Black Hills. For years, Carrie Ingalls was a working single woman, independent, employed, self-supporting, in an era that did not make that easy or comfortable. She set type by hand for newspapers across South Dakota, her fingers learning the upside-down backward alphabet of the printer's case. She worked in Smet and then out in the rough country of the Black Hills, in mining towns full of men and dust and noise, a small unmarried woman holding down a skilled trade far from home. She even filed and proved up a homestead claim of her own, a single woman, claiming land under her own name, living out on it alone to satisfy the law, which was a quietly remarkable thing for a frail woman to do in that era. For most of her adult life, Carrie was not waiting around for a husband. She was earning her own keep, building her own small independence in a world that gave women very few ways to do either. And maybe that is part of the answer to why the children never came. Not tragedy, exactly, just time, slipping by. The frail one became the working one, and the working one stayed busy, and the years went, and the window that the era considered proper for marriage and motherhood quietly closed while she was setting type in a Black Hills print shop. By the time love finally found her, the part of life that made grandchildren was already behind her. She did not marry until she was 41 years old, 41, in 1912, and when she finally did marry, she married a widower, a man named David Swansea, a mining man out in Keystone, South Dakota, near where Mount Rushmore would later be carved. In fact, David Swansea is remembered partly for his role in the naming of Mount Rushmore. He already had 2 children from his first marriage, a boy and a girl, whose own mother had died. So when Carrie married David, she did not start a family. She stepped into the middle of one that was already grieving. She became a stepmother. She raised those 2 children. By all accounts, she loved them and they loved her. But they were not her blood. They were not Caroline's grandchildren. They were the children of another woman who had died. And Carrie, at 41, frail her whole life, never had a child of her own. The age, the health, the timing. By the point Carrie finally found her marriage, the window for children had effectively closed. She gave a great deal of love to 2 children. None of them carried the Ingalls blood. And here is where it turns almost unbearably ironic, because Carrie, of all of them, ended up surrounded by children. Her stepdaughter, Mary Swansea, grew up and married and had a large family of her own. By the records, something like 14 children. 14. So Carrie, the frail spinster who married at 41, spent her later years as a step-grandmother to a whole crowd of little ones, a house that could fill with a dozen children at a holiday. From the outside, it would have looked like exactly the loud, crowded old age Caroline had wanted for one of her girls. Children everywhere, noise everywhere, and not one drop of Ingalls blood in any of them. Every one of those 14 children came down from David Swansea's first wife, the woman who had died, not from Carrie. Carrie loved them, surely. They were hers in every way that the heart counts. But they were not the answer to the question this family kept failing to answer. They were someone else's continuation, borrowed and loved, standing in the place where Caroline's grandchildren were supposed to be. Carrie died in 1946, out in the Black Hills country, having mothered more children than any of her sisters, and having added not a single name to her own family's tree. Now Grace, the baby, Grace Pearl Ingalls, born 1877, the last child Caroline ever had. Grace got, in some ways, the most ordinary life of any of them, and on the frontier ordinary was a kind of mercy. She grew up in Smet. She trained as a teacher, and in October of 1901, she married a local farmer named Nathan Dow. She was 24, a normal age, a normal marriage, a normal farm a few miles outside town near a tiny place called Manchester. Of all 4 daughters, Grace looked the most like a safe bet for the future. Young enough, healthy enough, married to a farmer at a sensible age, exactly the way her own mother had been. Grace and Nathan Dow were married for 40 years. They never had a single child. We do not know exactly why, and I am not going to invent a reason, because inventing reasons is how families get slandered by strangers a century later. What the record shows is simply this: 4 decades of marriage and no children, ever. Grace lived a quiet life as a farm wife, kept a diary, struggled with money and with diabetes in her later years, and died in 1941, childless. And there is something almost crueler about Grace's emptiness than about the others, precisely because hers should have been the safe one. Mary was blind. The world had an explanation for Mary. Carrie married at 41. The world had an explanation for Carrie, but Grace did everything right by the rules of her time. She married young, at 24. She married a healthy local farmer. She settled a few miles from her parents on solid ground near a town called Manchester. By every visible measure, Grace was the daughter most likely to fill a house with children. She had the years, she had the husband, she had the farm, and for 40 years, the cradle in that farmhouse stayed empty, and no record ever tells us why. She kept her little diaries of weather and chores and visits, the ordinary log of an ordinary farm wife, And nowhere in that quiet record is there the one thing the whole family needed her to have: a child. The baby of the family, the last one Caroline ever carried, lived a full and unremarkable life and added not one branch to the tree. Her diabetes worsened in her last years, in a time when that disease was still a slow death sentence for many, and she died in 1941 at 63, on the prairie where she had spent almost her whole life. Nathan outlived her. There was no child to bury her, because there had never been a child at all. And this is the exact spot where I have to stop and correct something. Because it matters, and because if you go searching this family online tonight, you are going to run straight into it. There are websites, some of them clearly churned out by content farms, some just careless, that confidently tell you Grace Ingalls Dow had a son and that her descendants are alive today. You will read it stated as fact. Grace had a child, the line continues, there are Ingalls descendants walking around. It is not true. Grace Ingalls Dow had no children. The serious record is clear and consistent on this. The genealogical records, the historical societies, the biographers who have actually done the work. Grace died childless in 1941. The story that she left descendants is an error that copies itself from one lazy website to the next, and it survives precisely because people want it to be true. People want this family to have continued. The need is so strong that the internet has manufactured a fake grandchild to satisfy it. It tells you something important about what we are really looking at tonight. The myth of this family is so powerful that it actively resists the truth. It generates comforting lies on its own, the way a body generates scar tissue over a wound. And the wound it is covering is this. Of Caroline Ingalls' 4 daughters, Mary never married, Carrie married late and raised another woman's children, Grace married young and bore none, and Laura had the one. Rose, that is the whole inheritance now of a family with 5 children. It has narrowed down to a single thread. 1 granddaughter, Rose Wilder, born in a claim shanty in 1886, the only blood descendant of Charles and Caroline Ingalls to live past infancy. Everything depends on her now. The entire future of the most famous family in American memory rests on one woman. And Rose, brilliant, restless, difficult Rose, was about to lose the only child she would ever carry, on a cold night far from home, in a way that closed the door on the bloodline forever. She just didn't know it yet. In a cemetery in Salt Lake City, Utah, Mount Olivet, there is a grave from 1909. The marker, such as it is, reads Baby Boy Lane. If you have been counting with me tonight, that name should land like a stone in your chest, because we have been here before, twice. A boy, no first name, a small grave a long way from the family's home. Freddie in the Lost Plot in Minnesota, the unnamed baby son in Smet, and now, a generation further on, Baby Boy Lane in Utah. 3 boys, 3 nameless or unmarked graves. 3 times this bloodline reached for a male child to carry it forward, and 3 times the child slipped away before anyone could even finish the simple act of naming him. This 3rd one is the one that ended everything, so let me tell you about the woman who carried him. Because she is the most extraordinary person in this entire family, and she is the one history hung the whole future on. Rose Wilder was born in 1886, the daughter of Laura and Almanzazo, the only grandchild of Charles and Caroline Ingalls who would ever grow up. And she grew up brilliant, restless to the bone. Where her mother had eventually settled into a Missouri farmhouse, Rose could not sit still in a room, let alone a state. She taught herself languages. She became a telegrapher, then a newspaper woman, then a world-travelling journalist and author, at a time when almost no woman did any of that. She lived in San Francisco, in New York, in Paris, in Albania, of all places which she loved. She became, frankly, more famous and more worldly in her own lifetime than her mother was, at least at first. Rose was a comet. Trace the path of her, because it is genuinely staggering, for a woman born in a claim shanty on the Dakota Prairie. She started as a telegrapher, learned the wire, the clicking code, a skilled technical job, and that got her off the farm and into the cities. From there she moved into newspaper work in San Francisco, then into magazine writing, then into books. She became a working, travelling, professional author at a time when the country could barely imagine such a thing for a woman. She crossed oceans on assignment. She reported from post-war Europe for the Red Cross. She lived in Paris in the 1920s. She wandered through the Balkans and fell hard for Albania, a place most Americans could not have found on a map. And she went back to it again and again like it was a second home. She wrote best-selling novels of the frontier. One of them, Freeland, a hit in its own right. She became, by the 1930s and 40s, one of the more recognized political writers in America, a fierce voice for individual liberty whose ideas helped seed a whole movement. People wrote her name in the same breath as the founders of modern libertarian thought. And then there is the part that folds back into her mother and grandmother. In those same years, Rose sat with Laura's handwritten memories of the Prairie childhood and worked them hard into the books that became the Little House series. The exact size of her hand in them is still argued over. Heavy editor, silent collaborator, near co-author, depending on which scholar you read. But strip the argument down, and the shape is undeniable. The childless daughter took her mother's raw memory and helped sculpt it into the most beloved version of this family that would ever exist. Rose could not extend the bloodline by a single day, so instead she extended the legend by a century. She poured the talent that would have gone into raising children into raising a monument made of pages, which makes what happened to her in 1909 land even harder, because all that brilliance, all that motion, all that fame still waiting in front of her, none of it could give her the one thing that would have actually carried her grandmother's family into the future. In 1909, Rose married a salesman and promoter named Gillette Lane, and not long after she became pregnant. This was it. Though no one announced it in those terms, this was the bloodline shot at a third generation. Caroline Ingalls' great-grandchild. The continuation, the pregnancy went wrong. Rose delivered a son prematurely, and the baby did not survive. He was born and lost in late 1909, and he was buried that November in Salt Lake City under that bare two-word marker, Baby Boy Lane. Rose was 22 years old, and then came the detail that turned a tragedy into an ending. In the aftermath, the sources point to surgery, likely in Kansas City not long after. Rose was left unable to bear any more children. We do not have her medical chart, and I will not pretend to one, but the outcome is not in dispute. After 1909, Rose Wilder could never have another child. The door did not just close on that one baby, it closed on every baby that would ever have come after him. That is the exact moment, if you want to put a date on it, that the Ingalls bloodline became a deadline walking. Late 1909, a premature birth and a surgery in the American West. From that point forward, every other person in this family was either past childbearing, childless, blind and unmarried, or already gone. Rose's was the only one who could have carried it forward, and now she couldn't. The future had a deadline, and the deadline had passed, and almost no one alive understood that yet. They would keep hoping, the way families do, but the math was already finished. Rose never spoke of the baby. This is the part that connects her, hauntingly, to her grandmother and to her mother. Laura left Freddie out of the books. Laura never named her own dead son. And Rose, the writer, the woman who put millions of words on paper, who wrote about Albania and revolution, and her own opinions on everything under the sun. Rose almost never wrote a single word about her dead child. He does not appear in her published work. He barely appears in her letters. The most articulate woman this family ever produced went silent on the one subject that had ended her line. 3 generations of women, and the same response to the same wound. Say nothing. Carry it. Keep moving. Rose's marriage did not survive either. She and Gillette Lane divorced in 1918, and Rose, childless now, and unable ever to be otherwise, poured everything she had into work, and, eventually, into her mother. This is where the famous part comes in, and it is worth understanding, because it is a strange kind of irony. In the 1930s, Rose came home, off and on, to that Missouri farm, and she sat with her aging mother, and she took the rough handwritten manuscripts Laura had been making of her childhood memories, and she edited them. Hard. How hard is a debate that scholars still argue about. Some think Rose was essentially a heavy editor, others think she was nearly a co-author who reshaped the books into the form that made them immortal. Either way, This much is real. The childless daughter helped build the family legend. Rose, who would leave no descendants, spent her talent making sure her family would never be forgotten. Think about the shape of that. The one person who could have given Caroline Ingalls a living future instead gave her a literary one. Rose could not continue the blood, so she helped preserve the story. She traded descendants for immortality. The family would live forever on paper, in libraries, in the hands of children, who would never know that the real people behind the warm cabin had, by then, no one left at all, and it was not a warm collaboration, which is its own small heartbreak. The bond between Laura and Rose was famously hard. Scholars who have read the letters describe two strong, stubborn women locked together by need and talent, and a great deal of friction, a mother and her only child, the only two left on the main line, and they could not always be in the same house without wounding each other. Rose struggled with her own dark stretches, with money, with a restlessness that never let her be content anywhere for long. She helped make her mother the most beloved author in America, and seems at times to have resented it, and to have resented her mother, and to have loved her fiercely underneath all of it. They were the last two. Everything came down to the two of them, and the two of them did not always make each other happy. There is no neat version of this. The pair who carried the family's memory across the finish line did it the way this whole family did everything. Under strain, in tension, with the warmth and the wound pressed up against each other the entire time. And when both of them were gone, Laura in 1957, Rose in 1968, the people who had turned the Ingalls family into something the whole world would love were themselves, the end of it. The two greatest keepers of the flame were also the last two to carry it. Rose Wilder Lane lived a long, loud, fascinating life. She became a major literary and political figure in her own right. She kept moving until the very end, and she died in October of 1968, in her sleep, at the age of 81 in Connecticut, the night before she was supposed to leave on yet another trip around the world. When Rose died that night in 1968, something died with her that no obituary mentioned. She was the last one, the last living descendant of Charles and Caroline Ingalls on the face of the earth. When her heart stopped, the bloodline stopped. Not a single human being alive, after that October night, carried the blood of the family that America had read about for generations, and would go on, reading about forever. The line did not end with a bang. It ended with an 81-year-old woman dying quietly in her sleep, with a suitcase half packed by the door. But Rose's death in 1968 is the end of the body. It is not the end of our story, because there is one more person we have to go back to, the woman this whole night has been about. The mother, Caroline, because Ma did not get to skip any of this. She did not die early and innocent, spared the worst. She lived long enough to watch most of it happen, in real time, with her own eyes, in her own house. And the question I have been holding all night is the one we answer now. How much did Ma know, and what did it do to her to know it? Nobody wrote down the worst part. That is usually where the truth lives. There is no diary entry where Caroline Ingalls sits down and says, "I have understood tonight that my family will end." There is no letter where she counts her childless daughters out loud. That is not how she worked. That is not how her whole generation of frontier women worked. The deepest things went unwritten because writing them down made them real, and a woman who had survived what Caroline survived did not go looking for ways to make the grief more real. So we have to reconstruct what she carried from the dates. And the dates are merciless. Charles Ingalls died in 1902, after more than 40 years of marriage, after all the wagons and all the moves and all the schemes that never quite paid off. Pa died of heart trouble in the house he had finally built in Smet, and Caroline became a widow. She was 62, and she would live another 22 years. 22 years, mostly in that house, mostly with Mary, the blind daughter and the widowed mother, in the rooms in town, growing old together. Pa's death itself was quiet, which is almost strange for a man whose whole life had been motion. Charles Ingalls, the dreamer, the wanderer, the fiddle in the dark, died in June of 1902 in Smet of heart trouble in his early 60s. He had finally stopped moving. After a lifetime of chasing the next piece of land, he died in a house in town, an ordinary house on an ordinary street, the restlessness finally spent. Laura came up from Missouri for the end. And then he was gone, and the man who had pulled this family across a continent was in the Smet cemetery, and Caroline was on her own. And we should be honest about Pa's part in all of this, because the books made him a hero, and the truth makes him something more complicated. Charles Ingalls was a good man and a loving father. That part is real. But his restlessness, the very thing the books turned into charm, was also a kind of engine of risk that ran over his own family for decades. Every time he heard about better land and packed the wagon, he was rolling his children into fresh danger, new diseases, new water, new isolation, new winters in places that were not ready for them. He moved the family something like a dozen times. The losses tended to happen in the gaps between his hopes. Freddie died mid-move on the way to one of Pa's new starts. The hardest years happened in the worst of his gambles. None of it was malice. All of it was a man who could not stop believing the next place would be the one that finally worked, and a family that paid the tab for that belief in ways he may never have fully tallied. And Pa, too, died without what he most wanted. He had named his only son after himself, the boy who was supposed to carry the Ingalls name off his branch into the future. And that boy had been in the ground for 26 years by the time Charles died. He had 4 daughters who would all, one way or another, marry out of the name or never marry at all. When Charles Ingalls died in 1902, he had exactly 1 grandchild, Rose, a divorced young woman who had already lost her own only baby. So, the dreamer died the same way his wife would die 22 years later, with the name running out, the line thinning to a thread, and the future he had chased across a continent quietly refusing to arrive. What she had left in that house was Mary. And money worries always. The 2 women lived modestly, carefully, the way Caroline had lived her whole life, taking in small economies, keeping the rooms neat, keeping up the respectability that had always mattered to her, even when there was almost nothing behind it. The town knew them as the widow Ingalls and her blind daughter, 2 aging women in a quiet house, the last of the old Prairie days, while the century turned over into automobiles and electric light, and a world Charles would not have recognized. And in that quiet, Caroline had a great deal of time to do the things she had always done. Count. Look at what was and what was not, and what was never going to be. We have talked on this channel before about how alone those years were for Caroline. The long, quiet after Pa. But tonight I want you to see those same years through a different lens. Not just the loneliness of a widow. The slow, dawning arithmetic of a grandmother who is running out of grandchildren to hope for. Because watch what Caroline could see from that house, year by year, as she aged. She could see Mary right there beside her, blind and unmarried, and she had long since understood that Mary would never bring in a child into the family. That door had closed back in 1880. Caroline lived with that closed door every single day, in the form of the daughter she loved and tended, and would, in fact, outlive almost to the end. She could see Carrie working, travelling, single, well into her 30s, and then her 40s. And when Carrie finally married in 1912, the Caroline was 73 years old, and the marriage was to a widower with grown children, and any mother could do that math. There would be no baby from Carrie, not at 41, not from that frail body, not in that situation. Another door, closing in her own lifetime, where she could watch it. She could see Grace, married since 1901, out on the farm near Manchester. 10 years went by. 15, 20, no children. Caroline lived long enough to see 2 full decades of Grace's marriage produce no grandchild. She did not need a doctor to explain it to her. She could simply count the empty years. And she could see Laura, far away in Missouri now. And she knew the truth about Laura that the rest of the world wouldn't learn for decades. She knew about the baby boy in 1889, the one with no name, buried right there in the Smet cemetery where Caroline herself would one day lie. She knew Laura had never had another, and she knew about Rose, the one bright grandchild, the only one, and she lived until 1924, which means Caroline was alive in 1909 when Rose lost her own baby in Salt Lake City and was left unable to have more. Do you see it now? Do you see what Caroline could see? By the time she was an old woman, Caroline Ingalls had enough information to know the ending. She had 1 living grandchild, Rose, who was divorced and could never have a child. She had 3 daughters who would clearly never make her a grandmother. And she had a string of small graves behind her. Her son, Freddie, lost in Minnesota. Her grandson with no name, a few steps from her own future plot. A reasonable woman, sitting in that house in Smet in 1920, counting the way Caroline always counted, would have arrived at a single unbearable conclusion. There will be no one after us. The family stops here, with these old women, in this town, and she said nothing, because what was there to say? That is what Ma carried. Not a single dramatic blow, but the slow accumulation of every closed door, absorbed in silence, year after year, in a quiet house with a blind daughter for company. The television gave you a smiling mother by a warm stove. The record gives you a woman in her 80s who had buried a son, a husband, and the entire future of her family, and who got up every morning anyway, and kept the house clean and kept Mary fed, and kept her grief where no one could see it. That is not the soft Ma of the show. That is something much harder and much more impressive and much sadder. And you have to understand what grandchildren actually meant to a woman like Caroline, because it was not what they mean now. Today a grandchild is mostly joy, a sweetness at the end of life, photographs, visits. On the frontier, a grandchild was that, but it was also the entire point of the work. Children were the labour that kept a farm alive, and grandchildren were the proof that the farm, the name, the back-breaking decades of it, would continue after you were gone. They were your old age insurance, the hands that would care for you when you could no longer care for yourself. They were the answer to the only question that a hard life ever really asks. Was it worth it? Did any of this last? A woman counted her grandchildren the way a farmer counts seed saved back for next year's planting. They were the future, made flesh, sitting in the room with you. Caroline saved her seed. She planted 5 children across a brutal continent and brought 4 of them to adulthood through fevers and blizzards and moves that would have killed lesser families. By every rule she had ever lived by, that should have bought her a parlour full of grandchildren in her old age. A loud and crowded reward for everything she had survived. It bought her a quiet house, a blind daughter, and the slow understanding that the planting had not taken. That when she was gone, and her girls were gone, there would be no next year's crop. Nothing she had carried would be carried any further. For a woman whose entire identity was built on protecting and continuing her family, there is no crueler sentence than that, and she had to read it alone, in silence, a little more clearly every year. There is a cruelty in how this worked out, and I want to name it because it is the heart of the whole thing. Caroline Ingalls spent her entire life doing the one job her world handed her. Make a family, protect a family, carry a family forward. She did it under conditions that would break most people. She crossed half a continent in a wagon doing it, and the reward, at the end of a life of that labour, was to sit in a town in South Dakota and slowly understand that none of it would continue, that the family she had bled for had no future, that she had built something that would simply stop. She died in 1924, at 84, in Smet. By then she had outlived her husband and her only son. She had not technically lived to see the very last act. Rose would not die until 1968, decades later. So you could argue Caroline died, without absolute proof that the line was finished. But that is a thin mercy, and I don't think it's much of one, because everything she could see told her the truth. The proof came later. The knowing came early. Her own end was quiet, the way she had lived. In the spring of 1924, after years of failing slowly in that house in town, Caroline died at 84. Mary, blind, was there. The daughter she had tended for more than 40 years was beside her at the finish, the 2 of them having outlasted Pa, and outlasted the Prairie days, and outlasted almost everyone they had started with. There was no crowd of grandchildren at the bedside. There were no small great-grandchildren brought in to say goodbye to the matriarch. There was an old blind daughter, and a town full of neighbours, and a century that had already moved on to a faster, louder world. A woman who had begun her life in the woods of Wisconsin before the Civil War, who had crossed the frontier in a covered wagon, died in a quiet house with a radio age coming on, having seen the whole arc of it, and having watched her family arrive at its end before she reached hers. They buried her in the Smet cemetery, near the husband who had dragged her across the country chasing land, and near the nameless grandson, who had lasted less than a month in the summer of 1889. The grandmother and the grandson, in the same ground, in the same town, the closest thing to a family reunion that this bloodline had left. But the story is not over, even now, because the children Caroline left behind, the blind one, the babies, the famous one, still had to live out their own endings, one by one, through the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s. They were going to die, in an order, and with a strange final pattern to who got remembered and who didn't, and the very last of them to go would be the one who had turned the whole family into a legend, and who would die in a Missouri farmhouse knowing, better than anyone, that there was no one left to inherit it. A family does not vanish all at once. It vanishes in funerals. One coffin, then a wait, then another coffin, until the cemetery holds more of the family than the dinner table does. So let us walk through the last of them, in the order the ground took them, because the order itself tells a story. The first of the 5 children to go was Mary, the blind one, the golden daughter whose door had closed at 14. She died in 1928, 4 years after her mother, of complications following a stroke. The same kind of word that had hovered over her since the fever that took her sight half a century earlier. She had lived almost her entire adult life dependent, first on her parents, then on her sisters, and she died having never married and never had a child, exactly as that cruel world had decided for her back in 1880. 48 years she lived in the dark. And when she died, she took with her the oldest of the family's closed doors. Mary's line had been over before it started. Now Mary herself was over too. Then Grace, in 1941, the baby of the family, the last child Caroline ever bore, died on a farm near the town where she had spent most of her life, after years of failing health and diabetes, with her husband Nathan at her side, and no children to stand at the grave. 40 years of marriage, no descendants, the youngest daughter gone at 63, and the line no wider for her having lived. Then Carrie, in 1946, the frail, sharp, independent one, the typesetter, the newspaper woman, the stepmother, died out in the Black Hills country she had worked in for so long. She had given years of love to her husband's 2 children, but they were not her blood, and they carried another family's name. When Carrie died, she left stepchildren who mourned her and not one descendant who shared her grandmother's blood. Look at what's left now after 1946. Of Caroline's 5 children, 4 in the ground, Freddie since 1876, Mary, Grace, Carrie, and only one is still standing, the wild one, Laura. Laura Ingalls Wilder outlived every single one of them. She outlived her parents. She outlived her blind older sister, and both of her younger sisters, and the baby brother she could never bring herself to write about. She outlived her own son by 68 years. By the late 1940s, Laura was an old woman alone on Rocky Ridge Farm in Missouri. Almanzo died in 1949, after 64 years of marriage, and she was by then the last Ingalls child left alive on Earth, the last keeper of all of it, the only person who still remembered the inside of the cabin in the big woods, because she was the only one of them still breathing, and here is the irony so sharp it could cut you. During those exact years, the years when Laura was burying her whole family and ending up alone, those were the years her books became a phenomenon. The Little House series, published through the 1930s and 40s, made the Ingalls family famous across America. While the actual Ingalls family was dying out completely, the legend was being born at the precise moment the bloodline was finishing its death. Millions of children were meeting Mary and Carrie and Ma and Pa on the page, falling in love with them. In the very decade, those real people were being lowered into the ground with no grandchildren to carry them on. Laura built a monument to her family out of words, and she built it while standing almost entirely alone at the end of the line. She died on February 10th, 1957, in the farmhouse at Rocky Ridge, 3 days after her 90th birthday. With her death, the last of Charles and Caroline Ingalls' 5 children was gone. The generation was complete, closed, finished. Everyone who had ridden in those wagons as a child was now in the earth. And the entire future of the family, every hope Caroline had ever counted, now rested on exactly one living person, Rose, the granddaughter who could not have children. The last thread, and by now, a thread that everyone understood could never be tied to anything. Rose lived 11 more years. She spent them as she had spent all her years, restless, working, opinionated, planning the next trip. And on the night of October 30th, 1968, Rose Wilder Lane died in her sleep in Danbury, Connecticut, with her bags packed for a 3-year journey around the world she would never take. That night, the bloodline of Charles and Caroline Ingalls ended, completely, forever, not narrowed, not scattered into distant cousins, ended. From the moment Rose's heart stopped, there has not been one single human being alive who descends from the family in those books. Not one. The most beloved family in the history of American childhood reading produced, in the end, 0 living descendants. The line, that began with a wedding in Wisconsin in 1860, ran for 108 years, and then simply stopped in a quiet house in Connecticut with a suitcase by the door. So who got it all? That is not a small question. By the time Rose died in 1968, the Little House books had become an empire, millions of copies, a fortune in royalties, a literary estate that would only grow because a television series was about to arrive and turn the Ingalls family into a household name all over again. Somebody was going to inherit that. The money, the rights, the control over how this family's story got told for the next half-century. And Rose had no child, no blood heir of any kind. The last descendant of Charles and Caroline Ingalls was about to die with the most valuable thing the family had ever produced sitting in her hands, and no one of her blood to leave it to. So she did what she had done with everything else in her life. She chose. Years earlier, Rose had met a bright teenage boy named Roger Leah McBride. He was the son of an acquaintance, and Rose, childless, restless, brilliant, lonely in her way, more or less adopted him. Not legally, not at first, emotionally. She mentored him, argued politics with him, shaped his mind, and over the years she came to call him her adopted grandson, and he called her Grandma. He was not an Ingalls. He was not a Wilder or a Quiner. He shared not one cell of the blood that had crossed the prairie in that wagon. He was simply the young man Rose Wilder Lane decided to love like family. And when she died in 1968, she left him everything. The estate, the papers, the royalties, and the rights to the Little House books themselves. Think about what that means in the context of this whole long night. The single most precious inheritance this family ever created, the story that made them immortal, did not pass to a grandchild, because there was no grandchild. It passed sideways, out of the blood entirely, to a young man whose only claim was affection. Roger McBride became the keeper of the Ingalls legacy. He managed the books. He was deeply involved in bringing the family to television, the version that would make Ma and Pa famous to a generation that never read a page. He even commissioned new novels about Rose's own childhood. He carried the family's name and story forward into the future with real devotion. He just could not carry the blood because the blood was not his to carry, because by then it did not exist in anyone. So even the inheritance tells the same story as the graves. The estate found an heir. The legend found an heir. The bloodline did not. Everything this family had, the fame, the fortune, the immortality, got handed to people who loved them. The one thing that cannot be handed to someone who merely loves you, the continuation of your actual flesh, simply ended. Rose gave a stranger her whole world because there was no grandchild to give it to. That was the last act of the line. A borrowed grandson, inheriting the memory of a family whose blood had already run out. There are Ingalls descendants alive today. That sentence is true. It is also, in the way most people mean it, a lie. Everything depends on which word you lean on. And the gap between those two readings is the cruelest little detail in this entire story, so I want to close it before we finish. Here is the confusion. When people say the Ingalls family, they picture the cabin. Pa, Ma, Mary, Laura, Carrie, Grace. The Little House family. That specific household. And that specific household, as you now know, left no one. Their direct line is finished, sealed shut in 1968. But Charles Ingalls was not an only child, and neither was Caroline Quiner. Far from it. Charles was one of about 10 children. He had brothers and sisters, Peter, Lydia, Polly, Lansford, Docia, Hiram, George, Ruby, a whole crowd of Ingalls siblings. And Caroline had her own set of Quiner brothers and sisters. These were big families, the way frontier families were, and many of those brothers and sisters did exactly what Charles and Caroline's children failed to do. They married, and they had children, and those children had children, all the way down to people walking around right now. So yes, there are people alive today who descend from Charles Ingalls' brother Peter. There are people who descend from his sisters. The Ingalls blood, in the broad sense, continues, just not through the famous branch. It runs through the siblings nobody made a television show about. Sit with that contradiction for a second, because it is almost unbearable once you see it. Charles's sister Lydia, for example, a name almost no one outside genealogy circles has ever heard, married, and had a family, and her line went on. Lydia is a footnote, a sister history barely noticed, and Lydia has descendants. Meanwhile, her brother Charles, the one whose family became immortal, the one whose daughters sold tens of millions of books, the one whose face is on statues and whose cabin is a museum. Charles has no one. Fame and survival ran on opposite branches. The relatives the world forgot are the ones who continued. The relatives the world fell in love with are the ones who vanished. The exact blood that America adopted as its own storybook family is the exact blood that did not make it. And this is why you keep running into that confusion online, the one we hit with Grace earlier. Somebody finds a real, documented Ingalls descendant, a great-great-grandchild of Peter, say, or a cousin 3 times removed through one of the other siblings, and they announce the Ingalls line lives on, and in a technical surname sense, they are right, the name survives. But that descendant does not come down from Charles and Caroline. They come down sideways, from a brother or a sister. They are cousins to the legend, not heirs of it. They share an ancestor with Laura, but they do not descend from her parents. There is even a strange knot in the family that makes this messier, and it is worth a moment because it tells you how tightly bound these people were. 2 of Charles's siblings married 2 of Caroline's siblings. Brother and sister on one side, marrying sister and brother on the other. It bound the Ingallses and the Quiners into a double weave, so that some of the cousins in this extended family were related twice over, sharing as much blood as half-siblings. That tangled web produced plenty of descendants. The family was, in raw biological terms, fertile and sprawling and very much continued, just not at the centre, not where it mattered to the legend. The centre hollowed out completely while the edges thrived. So when I say Caroline Ingalls has no descendants, hear it precisely, because precision is the only honest way to tell this. I am not saying no human being carries any drop of related blood. I am saying that the line from Charles and Caroline, through Mary, through Laura, through Carrie, through Freddie, through Grace, through Rose, that specific line, the Little House line, the one in the books, is gone. The grandchildren the famous family was supposed to produce do not exist. The cousins, on the forgotten branches, inherited the blood. The famous branch inherited only the silence and the books. Caroline could not have known which way it would break when she was young. No mother counting her babies in a Wisconsin winter knows whose line will thrive and whose will die. But it broke the worst possible way for her. The branch she sat on, the one she watered with everything she had, is the one that withered. And the proof is in any honest family tree you can pull up tonight. Follow Charles and Caroline down, and the branch ends in a row of childless deaths and 3 tiny graves. Follow the siblings down, and the branch keeps going. Same tree, same name, 2 completely different endings. And the world only ever learned the names of the people on the branch that died, which brings us all the way back to the beginning, to the thing I told you to believe, and the reason it isn't true. So, let's go back to where we started tonight. I told you that you were allowed to believe something, that somewhere out there, right now, someone carries this blood, a great-great-grandchild with the family's chin, someone who could stand at the grave and say, "That was mine." Now you know, there is no one, there never will be. You can drive to Smet, South Dakota, and stand in the cemetery where Caroline and Charles lie, and where the nameless baby of 1889 lies a few steps away, and you will be standing in front of the end of a family, No descendant will ever come to tend those graves out of blood obligation, because no descendant exists. Strangers tend them now, fans, people who love the books. The family is cared for, in death, entirely by people it is not related to. Thousands of them come every year. They drive into Smet from all over the country, off the interstate, out across the flat Dakota land, to stand where the cabin stood and walk through the cemetery and read the names off the stones. Charles, Caroline, Mary, Carrie, Grace, the baby son. Most of the family is there, together, in that one Prairie cemetery, though not Laura, who lies far away in Missouri, next to Almanzo, and, eventually, next to Rose, the three of them in Mansfield, the last little cluster of the line 1,000 miles from the rest. The visitors leave flowers. They leave small tokens. They cry sometimes, strangers crying over people they never met and are not related to, because the books made these people feel like family to half of America. It is a strange and moving thing. A family with no descendants, mourned by millions who share none of its blood. The legend adopted the orphaned dead, and it is the only reason anyone visits at all. There is one thing out there, though, that the family left behind that is actually still alive. Not a person. Trees. When the Ingalls family proved up their homestead outside Smet, Pa planted a small ring of cottonwood saplings near the house, and the story that came down with them is that he planted one for Caroline and one for each of his girls. Little whips of trees on the bare Dakota prairie, one for every woman in his family, and more than 140 years later, out at the Ingalls homestead site, cottonwoods still stand on that ground. Tall now, huge. Visitors walk under them every summer. Think about what that means. The only living things Charles and Caroline Ingalls left on this earth are trees. Not a grandchild. Not a great-grandchild. Not one human being who carries their blood. Just a stand of cottonwoods on the prairie, planted by a hopeful father for a wife and 4 daughters, whose line would end inside a single century. Trees that outlived every single person they were planted for, and that will go on rustlings over an empty homestead long after the last visitor who remembers why they matter has gone home. Pa planted a future. It came up as timber. It was the only kind of future this family ever got to keep. And think about the 3 small graves we found along the way. Freddie, in a lost plot in Minnesota that no one can even point to anymore. The unnamed baby son in Smet. Baby Boy Lane in Salt Lake City. 3 boys across 3 generations in 3 different states, and not one of them got a name on a stone that anyone visits. The Bloodline tried 3 times to make the child who would carry it forward. 3 times the child died nameless. That is not a curse. There is no curse. It is just the frontier and disease and bad luck and the ordinary arithmetic of an era that killed its children casually, landing, again and again, on one specific family until there was nothing left of it but paper. Because that is the last, strangest truth of tonight. This family is more alive in the world right now than almost any family from the 1800s. Stop and feel how upside down that is. You probably cannot name your own great-great-grandparents. You do not know what their voices sounded like, what they feared, what they buried. They have dissolved completely, the way almost everyone does within a few generations of dying. That is the normal fate of a human being, to be forgotten by the world and remembered, if at all, only by your own descendants. Most families survive in blood and vanish from memory. The Ingalls family did the exact opposite. They vanished from blood and survived in memory. A stranger in Tokyo or Sao Paulo can tell you about Mary going blind and Pa playing the fiddle, can feel something for these specific dead people, while not one human being on earth can say they share their blood. There are statues, there are museums, there are millions of books in print, in dozens of languages, read by children who were born 140 years after Mary went blind. In the imagination of the whole world, the Ingalls family is immortal. They will outlast you and me and everyone we know, and it keeps happening, generation after generation. Every couple of decades, the cycle starts again. New editions of the books for children who were not yet born the last time around. A new film, a new series, a new wave of families discovering the cabin, and the wagon, and the fiddle for the first time, falling in love all over again with Mary and Laura and Ma and Pa. Right now, somewhere, A child is hearing these names for the first time and deciding they are her favourite people in the world. That child will grow up feeling like she knows them, and she will never know that the real people behind those names left no one. That the family she loves so much is, in the only literal sense that counts, completely gone. The legend renews itself endlessly. The blood got exactly one run, and it is over. And in blood, in flesh, in the only way that actually continues a family, they are gone, erased, as if they had never been. And here is the question I cannot stop turning over, the one this whole story leaves sitting in your lap. Of the 5 children Caroline carried, the one who came closest to saving the line was Laura. And Laura is also the one who made absolutely certain the line would never be forgotten. Sit with the strange trade buried in that. If Laura had filled a farmhouse with 6 healthy children, she would almost certainly never have had the time, the silence, or the grief to sit down in her 60s and write. The books exist, in part, because the family was small and quiet, and wounded. The very emptiness that ended the bloodline is what freed the hand that made them immortal. A woman with a yard full of grandchildren does not spend her evenings reconstructing a dead baby brother she cannot bear to name. A woman with almost no one left does. So, the family bought its immortality with the same coin that bought its extinction. The fewer of them there were, the more famous they became. That is not a comforting thought, and I am not going to pretend it is, but it is the truth sitting underneath the warm version, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The most beloved family in American childhood reading is beloved partly because it was disappearing while it was being written down. We are reading, in those gentle books, the careful work of the last people on a dying branch, turning their own ending into something soft enough to hand to a child. They could not give the future a grandchild, so they gave it a story instead, and made very sure the story would outlast the silence. Caroline Ingalls spent her whole life on one task: build the family, protect it, carry it forward. She crossed a continent in a wagon to do it. She buried a son and kept going. She tended a blind daughter for decades. She counted and counted and counted the way she had counted since she was 5 years old, and watched her own father go under the water of Lake Michigan. And the final count, the one she could already read in the silence of that house in Smet, came to 0. The books made them immortal. The blood did not survive. That is the part the warm version could never tell you. That is what Ma watched, in silence, from a quiet house in South Dakota. Not a single dramatic tragedy. Just every door closing one at a time until the most famous family in America had no one left at all. And the only thing that would carry them into the future was the very thing Laura built to keep from having to feel it. A story. Just a story. Read it again tonight if you want. There is no one else left to read it for them,